UPR Info is pleased to publish today a unique study on the implementation of over 3,000 recommendations by 66 states. Based on our program called the Follow-Up, which started last year, this publication sheds light on states' practices and on the impact of the UPR on the ground. So the modalities of this program, it was started in June 2011. It looks into the human rights situation at midterm. So at midterm, 2 years after the review, we contact the government, the national institution, if any, the NGOs, and UN agencies to ask them information about the recommendations that were made. And those different stakeholders can comment one or all recommendations that a specific state has received. From all this information that we collect from those different stakeholders, we compile it together into a report that we call a midterm implementation assessment and publish it then online, and we also send it to the different permanent missions that made recommendations, and we send it to the civil society on the ground. The preparation of this midterm implementation assessment is based on information we receive, and we determine for every recommendation whether it was fully implemented, partially implemented, or not implemented based on the information we have received. Now to give a bit figures behind this program. So we've had so far published reports on 66 countries. We have received comments from 253 NGOs, 6 national institutions. We have used 7 midterm reports from states. And overall, we have received comments on 3,000 recommendations. We have been exchanging information with and exchanging contacts with those stakeholders on 6,000 recommendations, and out of the 6,000 recommendations, on 3,000 we received concrete comments by the stakeholders on the level of implementation in country. So looking at the results, which is what we are here for, you see that at midterm, on 40% of recommendations, actions have been taken by the government to implement the recommendations. 12% have been fully implemented at midterm, and 28% have triggered action. So we can say that at midterm, over 1,300 recommendations have triggered action from governments from those 66 countries. Now, when we look at all those responses, all those comments that we get from those different stakeholders, what does it tell us about the UPR process? First, when we look at the acceptance of recommendations, we see that 15% of rejected recommendations actually have triggered action by the government. So this is quite important because there's a lot of debate at the UPR whether what to do with those rejected recommendations. Should states engage on those? Should recommending states go back to those? Should stakeholders also engage UN agencies, national institutions, and should they engage on rejected recommendations? Is it a burning issue for the government? But what we see is that governments actually do look at those rejected recommendations. Now, when looking at the specificity of recommendations, and this is quite important as well because there's, again, a lot of discussion at the UPR, recommendations should be specific. What is the impact of having recommendations that are not specific in terms of implementation and to get results on the ground? So when we look at the impact of the specificity, as responses, we see that the more specific, the less implemented recommendations are. Now, turning into issues, we see that international instruments, women's rights, and the rights of the child are the most raised issues. Now, if we look at the issues that are most implemented through our program, we see a difference here. We have similar issues that are the most raised and get most implemented, but also we have other issues that get less implemented. So the issues that were most implemented are women, children, and international instruments, similarly to the ones that are most raised. On the other hand, we see that states have appeared on that graph, so that are more implemented than they are actually raised, such as minorities and freedom of the press. So those two issues, minorities and freedom of the press, are issues that are particularly implemented, whereas death penalty and human rights education and training are relatively, compared to the frequency of their mentioning of the UPR, they are less implemented than other issues. So So we can see how certain issues, again, have an importance on the implementation of recommendations. So what does it tell us for the UPR process again? Well, our program is unique in its kind because it provides information from the ground on the implementation of a large scale of recommendations and allows us to really determine the impact of the UPR on the ground. We've seen that responses, specificity, and the issue has an impact on the implementation of recommendations. The more specific, the less implemented. If recommendations are not accepted, they are unlikely to be implemented, but still they do trigger action from governments, and the issue obviously has an impact. And then finally, the study shows that the UPR is proven to provide significant impact and implementation of recommendations on the ground. Now, recommendations for an effective implementation, and we'll be happy to hear from the different panelists what they thought were good practices and what would help them in implementing recommendations at the national level. First is that the engagement of all stakeholders is important. This program will not be successful without the involvement of the different stakeholders, including national institutions, NGOs, and UN agencies, because they provide first-hand information on the ground that allows us to report. Rejected recommendations, I emphasize that, still need to remain on the table because they trigger some action from the government. Recommendations need to be specific because to measure the implementation, it's easier when you know concretely what action has been taken and what action was requested by the recommendation. And then states should be, they are already encouraged, but more emphasis should be put on voluntary midterm report by states, as this really provide information on the improvement on the ground, but also will help the government to prepare for the second cycle.